You're watching the lesson on cells and cell parts. This lesson will focus on the types of cells that exist, as well as the parts inside cells that allow cells to do their jobs. So, all life is made up of cells. We know this from previous lessons, and life can be made up of only one cell or many, many cells, right? So, here we have a type of paramecium or an amoeba of some sort, and it's only made of one cell. It's still alive, it's still considered life, but it's only made up of one cell. This little rabbit here, though, is made up of millions of cells. This is also considered alive, right? So as long as something's made up of cells, at least one cell, you can say that they are alive. So if you find a living thing and it's only made up of one cell, you, you call it unicellular. You say that it is unicellular. Uni means one, cellular means cell, right? So think of the word unicycle. Uni means one, cycle means turn or wheel. So there are millions of types of unicellular life forms, and you can see this in plankton. These are all different kinds of plankton, and they're all made up of one cell. They're all unicellular, and there are tons of different kinds. So if you took plankton and looked under a microscope, this is probably what you would see. So in this video, it'll show you how even though things can be unicellular, even though this living thing is made up of one cell, sometimes cells can work together even though they're individuals and perform a job. That is not to say that they are multicellular like we are, but sometimes unicellular life work together. The most common form of unicellular life is bacteria. The most common form of life that is made up of one cell that we run into or deal with in our daily lives is bacteria. And so it just kind of looks like a Cheeto in this case. And this is just one cell. And this type of cell, bacterial cells, well, they affect our health, they affect our pets, they affect our life in general. They affect how we digest food, they affect whether or not we get sick, they affect whether or not we can digest certain types of food. And so bacteria play a large role in our lives every day, and we're exposed to them every day. So even though something is unicellular and we are not, doesn't mean that unicellular life doesn't play a role or doesn't have an impact in our daily lives. So when we look in cells, we know that cells make up all life, and there are two types of cells. There are two types of cells. We have a cell type called a prokaryote and a cell type called a eukaryote. Now, the literal definition of these words, prokaryote means before kernel, but we're not going to use the word kernel. We're going to replace karyotes with nucleus, and pro means before, or you could just say no. So prokaryote basically means no nucleus, right? Eukaryote either means, literally means good kernel. Karyote means kernel, but we'll replace it with eukaryote means with nucleus. And the reason why that name came up, the kernel name came up, is because when people looked at cells in a microscope, they would see that some cells didn't have this little ball in the center called a nucleus. And so they said, oh, it looks like a kernel. And so they called it good kernel, eukaryote, and those without the kernel, prokaryote, or before kernel, or no kernel. Now that kernel refers to a nucleus, so instead of kernel, we'll say nucleus. So prokaryote means no nucleus. Eukaryote means with nucleus. The most common type of prokaryote you'll see is bacteria. Bacteria do not have a nucleus. Eukaryotes have nucleus or nuclei. So the one we'll be focusing on is eukaryotes, but I may ask a question of, well, what is the difference between a prokaryote and a eukaryote? So just know the difference between the two, but you don't have to go into too much detail. So we're going to be focusing on eukaryotes with nucleus. So when a living thing is made up of more than one cell, we say it is multicellular. So we had unicellular, made up of one cell. Now we have multicellular, made up of multiple cells. So there are two types. Now it says two types of cells. I should say two types of eukaryotic cells. Two main types of, you know what, I'm just going to cross that out and type in eukaryotes, right? Two main types of eukaryotes. You got your animal cell and you got your plant cell. They look very similar, but there are some key differences, as you note, here and here. And we'll talk about these differences as we go along. But what you need to know is that there are two main types of cells, eukaryotes and prokaryotes. We'll focus on eukaryotes. Eukaryotes can be divided into two types, animal cells and plant cells. So we're going to start with the animal cell. The animal cell is the eukaryotic cell that are in animals, meaning us. We are animals, right? So you'll find these types of cells in cows, you'll find these types of cells in people, you'll find these types of cells in birds, and so on. That's why they're called animal cells. They're found in animals. So these are all the parts of the animal cell, right? This is what the animal cell has that lets it do its job. It has this nucleus, this ribosome, mitochondria, Golgi body, etc., and all of these things work in the cell so that the cell can do its jobs. So in this case, you could say that these are the organs of the cell. But they're small, right? So we won't call them organs, we call them organelles. So when we're talking about the parts of a cell, when we say, well, what is this part? We're actually calling it an organelle. Organelles are the parts of cells. So please know that. Don't call them organs, call them organelles. So in the animal cell, there are 8 organelles you need to know. The cell membrane, the cytoplasm, the nucleus, the mitochondria, the vacuole, the endoplasmic reticulum, the ribosome, and the Golgi body. So cell membrane, cytoplasm, nucleus, mitochondria, vacuole, endoplasmic reticulum, ribosome, Golgi body. And so all of these things are found in animal cells, and these are the main organelles we're going to be talking about. So the first one, the cell membrane. It is that outer layer of the animal cell, right, going all the way around. And its job is to hold everything inside the cell and control what goes in and out of the cell, and control what goes in and out of the cell. So it makes sure that good things go in and bad things stay out, or bad things in the cell get kicked out. So the cell membrane, you could say, is like a big filter. It lets things in and kicks things out. The cell membrane acts like a big filter. It lets things in and kicks things out. And that's basically its job. It's more complicated than I'm saying, but in a nutshell, that's what it does. And it just acts like a big filter that protects the cell from its own waste and allows the cell to take in food. So this is a small picture I want to show so that it can help illustrate how the cell membrane works. So we have this line here. This is the cell membrane. And again, the job of the cell membrane is to hold everything in, right? So these are the organelles. Well, you wouldn't want the organelles to leave the cell, right? As much as you wouldn't want your stomach to just leave your body, right? So the cell membrane prevents this from happening. In addition, the cell membrane recognizes food when food touches it and lets it in. So food will just be allowed in. While at the same time, the cell produces waste, and so waste is taken out. And so when it approaches the cell membrane goes, oh, that's garbage, and throws it out. It makes sure that the waste can't get back in, and it makes sure that the food can't get back out. So the cell membrane acts like a filter, letting food in and waste out, and making sure that they don't backtrack, the food doesn't come out, and the waste doesn't come in. The cytoplasm. The cytoplasm is the liquid inside the cell. So this arrow is not really pointing to anything in particular, just the bluish liquid inside this cell, this sort of liquid in the cell holding all the organelles in place. So the cytoplasm holds all the organelles in place. And so what that means is that if I were to use a analogy of people, our heart, our stomach, our organs, well, they don't really move around too much, do they? You wouldn't want your stomach wandering around your body as much as you would want your heart wandering around your body. Well, the cell wants to keep their organelles relatively in their same space. They may jiggle or move around just a little bit, but the cytoplasm keeps everything in its place. And so the cytoplasm holds all the organelles in place. It's like a jello sort of mold that holds everything in its place. The nucleus, so we go back to eukaryote versus prokaryote. Remember, animal cells and plant cells are eukaryotes, meaning they have a nucleus. And so now we're going to discuss what a nucleus is. Nucleus can be considered the brain of the cell. You can see these in microscopes very easily when you're looking at cells. They are usually seen as a dark circle in the middle of the cell. And the job of the nucleus is to hold all the DNA in the cell. So you can call it the brain, you can even call it the information storage or the computer part of the cell because it holds all the information in the cell, all the DNA in the cell, right? So the nucleus's job is to hold all the DNA in the cell. And so you must have heard of DNA before, right? DNA is the code that makes, well, us, right? This chemical tells the body or the cells what eye color we have, what hair color we have, how tall we get, etc. And so DNA is very important, and so it's protected in the nucleus. And so any one of your cells that have a nucleus will have the blueprint for you. So if someone took the DNA out of just one of your cells, they would be able to make a copy of you with that DNA, just from one cell, right? So 37 trillion cells have information, have the DNA, that sort of blueprint of you. So if you were to look at a cheek cell, they kind of look like pancakes, and you can see right here, that dot in the middle, that's the nucleus. It holds the DNA for the cell. The mitochondria, this sort of weird brown looking bean over here, and you can see it here as well, these guys are called the powerhouse of the cell. And the reason why is because they make chemical energy. They make the energy for the cell. Without it, the cell can't function. Remember, all life needs energy, and the mitochondria makes that. It makes the energy in the form of something called ATP. Now, you don't need to know that, it's just a side interest thing. What you really need to know is just the mitochondria makes energy for the cell. And this is what it's called, ATP. And so the cell will make this ATP, and that's the energy the cell will use. So the mitochondria makes the energy for the cell. So this is a video that just talks about where the mitochondria comes from. It's more of an interesting side piece than something you need to know. The vacuole. The vacuole is like a balloon organelle that holds food and waste. So like how the nucleus holds the DNA, the vacuole holds food and waste. Now animal cells can have multiple vacuoles, right? So you could have a vacuole here, you could have a vacuole here. This one could be food and this one could be waste, right? So the animal cell's vacuole's job is to store food and waste. The endoplasmic reticulum, big word, the endoplasmic reticulum. This organelle sits just outside the nucleus. So you have your nucleus here, holding all the DNA, and you have this sort of fanning out organelle here. Well, that is the endoplasmic reticulum, and its job is makes ribosomes. It's more complicated than that, but we'll leave it at that. Its job is it makes ribosomes. That's it. Now you have ribosomes, right? So if you look carefully at this picture, you may see some dots here, 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 here. So those dots are the ribosomes. And the ribosome's job is to make proteins. So the endoplasmic reticulum sits outside the nucleus. And the endoplasmic reticulum makes ribosomes. The ribosomes make proteins. Okay. The Golgi body, this one's a bit confusing. It's this blobby guy way over here. This guy right here. This guy, I like to think of him as the post office. Whenever food or waste or whatever goes into the cell, the Golgi body picks it up and goes, okay, where should this go? And it makes small packages called vesicles. It makes small packages called vesicles, and those vesicles get sent to where they need to go. So if the cell needed energy, for example, the food would go into the Golgi body. The Golgi body would go, oh, this is food. It would stamp that and make a vesicle. The vesicle would then be sent to the mitochondria, where it'll be used to make energy. Well, the mitochondria will make some waste, right? So that waste will then be sent back to the Golgi body. The Golgi body will be like, oh, that's waste. Put it into a vesicle, and then kick it out. So it's like FedEx or the post office, where it collects materials, collects things, makes packages for them called vesicles, and then sends them to where they need to go. So vesicles are small round organelles that are used to move food and waste throughout the cell. It's mainly made to move things throughout the cell. So the Golgi body collects and sends things throughout the cell in small packages called vesicles. That's probably the most complicated one, but other than that, these parts should be pretty easy because I've sort of only given you 1 or 2 sentences for each one. So quick review. You have 8 things you need to know for the animal cell. The cell membrane. It acts like a filter. It kicks things out and lets things in. The cytoplasm. The liquid in the cell that holds everything together. The nucleus. The nucleus holds all the DNA in the cell. It's usually found in the center. The mitochondria makes energy for the cell. The vacuole stores food and waste. Animal cells can have more than one. The endoplasmic reticulum makes ribosomes. Ribosomes makes protein. The Golgi body sends food and waste through vesicles to where they're needed. So we'll be covering the plant cell in the next video. I want to cut this in half because this lesson is quite large, and I want you to just focus on the animal cell for this one, study that, and then we'll focus on the plant cell. All right, so thank you for listening, and we'll see you next lesson.